Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg welcomes you to this graduation ceremony. Due to security reasons, you are requested not to leave the auditorium before the end of the proceedings. Please note that photos and videos must be taken from your seats. Please do not get up and walk around inside the auditorium. As soon as the procession leaves the auditorium, you are requested to rise and remain standing until the procession and guests of honor have left the auditorium. A kind yet important request. Please only applaud after the student's name has been read out, and only applaud until the student has been capped, in order to give other graduates the opportunity to have an audible readout of their names. Please also note that no whistles are allowed for applause, only clapping of hands and ululating. A final request. If you have a cell phone in your possession, please switch it off or put it on silent. Ladies and gentlemen, the procession will now enter the auditorium. You are requested to rise and remain standing until the members of the procession have taken their seats.
Sigitur juvenestum sumus, gaudiamus sigitur juvenestum sumus, post secundam juventutem, post molestam selectutem, nos habebitumus, nos habebitumus. Vivat academia, vivat professores, vivat academia, vivat professores, vivat membrum quelibet, vivat membrum quelibet, semper sint in flore, semper sint in flore.
Dumelang. You don't sound happy to be here. Let's try again. Dumelang. Goeiedag, dames en heren. Goeiedag, dames en heren. That's better. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Avusheni, sanibonani. By virtue of the powers vested in me, I now constitute this meeting as a lawful congregation of the University of Johannesburg. You may please be seated.
senhliziyo wethemba lami helele mafohloza lavi wesitu wami sithandwa sami lavi wami mafohloza dali wami helele mafohloza kuba buhlungu inhliziyo wethemba lami uma ngicabanga nawe lavi what to do wami sithandwa sami lavi wami mafohloza dali wami helele mafohloza dali lavi sweetie waze wangiphatha kahle ulale sifubeni dali lavi sweetie waze wangiphatha kahle ulale sifubeni elele mama njengengane ncane
wangibamba kwamancane wangibambele duze bese
sithandwa sami
segoli mama ezola
stimela samsasezola
wangibeke sifubeni we mama
elele mama njengengane ncane
wangibamba kwamancane wangibambele duze bese
sithandwa sami
segoli mama ezola
stimela samsasezola
wangibeke sifubeni we mama
helele mama njengengane ncane
Woza mafohloza,
love you sweetie
woza mafohloza,
love you sweetie what to do wami sithandwa sami love wami mafohloza dali wami helele mafohloza
woza mafohloza,
love you sweetie
woza mafohloza,
love you sweetie what to do wami sithandwa sami love wami mafohloza dali wami helele mafohloza.
I think that the UJ choir deserves another round of applause. Chancellor, I'd like to first ask the honorary doctorate recipient today to please stand up, since I will now introduce you. In his 2001 novel By the Sea, Nobel Prize winner Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah wrote, and I quote, "In their books I read unflattering accounts of my history, and because they were unflattering, they seemed truer than the stories we told ourselves. I read about the diseases that tormented us, about the future that lay before us, around the world we lived in and our place in it. It was as if they had remade us, and in ways that we no longer had any recourse but to accept, so complete and well-fitting was the story they told about us. I don't suppose the story was told cynically because I think they believed it too." End of quote. Professor Gurnah's words reflect on the important but often unspoken experiences of colonialism, being a refugee, displacement in an uncertain world, and reclamation of these narratives. As he phrased it as at his Nobel lecture in 2021, he began writing, and I quote, "in refusal of the self-assured summaries of people who despised and belittled us," close quote. The weight of these often forgotten stories and narratives is profound and reverberates beyond his own context. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNCHR, at the end of 2021, there were 89.3 million forcibly displaced people, of which an estimated 36.5 million are children below 18. In the past decade, the global refugee population has more than doubled, and scholars are not shying away from the term refugee crisis. The increasing population of refugees represents a generation grappling with uncertainty around their place in a turbulent and fractured world. Professor Gurnah, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in October last year for his, and I quote, uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee in the gulf between cultures and continents, speaks out only to this experience but challenges the dominating Western narratives. To place Professor Gurnah's own history into context, he was born in Tanzania in 1948 in what is now referred to as Zanzibar. When he was 18, he fled to the United Kingdom as a refugee following the overthrow of the ruling Arab elite in the Zanzibar Revolution, which has been described as the most violent outbreak of anti-Arab violence in the post-colonial African history. As the revolution unfolded, the killing and expulsion of a large number of Arabs was coupled with the nationalization and redistribution of land. Professor Gurnah, who was on a family holiday in Dar es Salaam on the day of the revolution, but watched on as Zanzibar's fleeing sultan and former British officials arrived at its port. When he returned to Zanzibar, he drove past the destruction and realized the impact of what had transpired. In the aftermath, it became apparent that there was little future for Professor Gurnah and his brother if they stayed. As Professor Gurnah studied in England and settled into a new life, he wrote voraciously about his experiences as the feeling of being dislocated crept in. As Gurnah began the writing process, he had the deeply unsettling realization that, I quote, a new, simpler history was being constructed, transforming and even obliterating what had happened, close quote. His work challenges imposed narratives and represents a real, painful, but true retelling of history and experience. It explores themes of exile and diaspora, identity and uprootedness, migration and displacement, alienation and belonging, and memory and loss. These are themes that reverberate through the global South and speaks to many of our own experiences despite differing contexts. The nomination of Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah for a UJ honorary doctorate is premised on this invaluable contribution to literature, his delving into the topics and themes that derive from colonial experiences and trauma, the need to tell the histories of migration, refugee plight, and deep historic and ongoing social injustices. We too are a deeply fractured nation, grappling with the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. As recent years have demonstrated, the shift to decolonizing our systems and structures is a painful but necessary process. Professor Gurnah's work has demonstrated what it means to decolonize our narratives in the exploring of our fractured past with deep and pressing desire to reimagine a more equitable future. This fundamentally speaks to UJ's vision. This honorary doctorate represents Professor Gurnah's stature in this space and his fight for our own stories, even though ugly, even though painful, to be told. It is thus an honor to confer this doctorate on Professor Gurnah as the legacy of his work and the power of his words that continue to inspire and challenge us. Now you can imagine that I can have Professor Gurnah standing for a while if I continue and say more. And for that reason, I will pause on that account of the Laudatio. With that, Chancellor, I now request you to confer the degree Philosophiae Doctor Honoris Causa in Literature on Abdulrazak Salim Gurnah.
By virtue of the powers vested in me, I now confer the degree Philosophiae Doctor Honoris Causa in Literature on Abdulrazak Salim Gurnah.
I will now invite Professor Gurnah to deliver a short speech. Professor Gurnah, let's give him another round of applause.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. For a moment, I thought I was going to have to kneel on that thing. You know, like when they do that sort of stuff, you know. Anyway, it's good to be here, especially for such an occasion, but in any case, it's good to be here. The subject, colonialism and the refugee experience, was one that was suggested to me, and it recalled a conversation I overheard, which was, why are they still talking about this colonialism when it's over? I remember Gordon Brown, when he was Prime Minister some years ago, visiting Tanzania and giving a press conference in Dar es Salaam. His wife apparently was either born or went to school in Tanzania. I can't remember which exactly. So he felt he had some connection. And somebody asked him a question, I suppose, about what's left, the consequences of British colonialism. And he said something like that. Why are you still talking about colonialism when it's over? Well, because it isn't, I guess, is why we're still talking about it. So I'm going to take you a long way away from now to begin thinking about this issue of refugees, or perhaps both refugees and colonialism. I'm going to take you to Othello. The lines from the opening scene of Othello include when Rodrigo comes to warn Desdemona's father of the designs of, I quote, the extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere. I'm guessing that most of you know, but that could be a mistaken guess. So essentially, Othello is a Moor, that is a Moroccan mercenary who is employed by the city of Venice, and he falls in love, and she falls back in love with a young noblewoman, Desdemona. So Rodrigo, who is rather jealous of this, is speaking to Desdemona's father and warning him about this extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere. So think about that, of here and everywhere, not of somewhere. Rodrigo at this moment is not concerned about specifying the origin of the Moor, but rather of rendering the idea of his origin as diffuse and vagrant. Perhaps these lines did not come to mind arbitrarily when I was thinking about this, but they certainly came unsummoned. I think this is not only because of the subject of the play, the love of the Moor for a Venetian woman, and hence all about how we live together, but also because we associate the Elizabethan period with the beginnings of imperialism. Mercantile naval adventures across oceans, the inauguration of the Atlantic slave trade, the planting, nice word, the planting of colonies in other people's territories. The increasing contact with cultures and peoples meant that they needed to be described and made comprehensible. But the desire to describe was not only concerned to render the exotic explicable. Here's another episode, which is contemporary with Shakespeare's play. In the last decades of the 16th century in England, an unprecedented series of inquiries were ordered by the highest councils in the kingdom, the Queen's Privy Council. The inquiry was into the condition and nature of strangers in the country, or more precisely, into the condition and nature of strangers settled among us. These inquiries were prompted by the perception that immigration, as we would learn to call it, had become a flood, a perception which had already prompted exclusionist speeches in Parliament, riots, and violent attacks in the streets, threatening pamphlets by guilds and apprentices, and warning sermons by the clergy. Sounds familiar? Strangers had been coming to England throughout the medieval period, and there were laws governing their rights and the limits to their rights concerning property and trading practices. What was different on this occasion was the scale of the immigration compared to the historical precedent. The numbers were not huge by contemporary standards, a few thousands over a period of 2 decades. But in appearance, they seemed alarming, both statistically as well as in the visible concentration of the strangers in particular areas of the cities and provinces. The motives of the strangers were also mixed. Whereas before they had been largely commercial, this new influx was influenced by the political position of England as Protestant haven. The strangers in this case were Huguenot French and Protestant Dutch, and many of them had come to stay. The reception of the strangers demonstrates, perhaps initiates, the twin traditions in Britain of asylum and xenophobia that are still competing today in the debates about asylum seekers. Examples of xenophobia in English history are plentiful prior to the moment in question here, from the expulsion and beggaring of Jews in 1290 to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, during which scores of foreigners, mostly Flemish workers, were deliberately sought out and beheaded by the rebellious citizens, even though they were irrelevant to the grievances behind the uprising. In between such frenzied acts of xenophobia were the daily lesser persecutions in English institutions and laws concerning property, trade, and the professions, as well as the casual hostility and harassment of individuals recorded by a variety of foreign visitors. The examples are too numerous to cite here in full, but they included a record kept by a retinue of the Bohemian Baron Leo of Rosmetal in the 1460s, which found the English inimical to strangers, or the remarks of Venetian ambassador to England at the end of the 15th century, who noted that the English were great lovers of themselves and thought that there was no people to equal them and no other world but England. The point is not to say that English xenophobia was unique in Europe, but with the increasing identification of 16th century England as a Protestant sanctuary, this hostility is twinned with asylum, which is enacted as a centralized state policy with its own complex and actively interventionist bureaucracy. My interest here is not to give you a history lesson, but to say we are in familiar territory now is not something that is new. My interest here is not in exploring the historical consequences of this policy, which despite the tensions it generated in English society, probably was highly influential in preparing the English economy for expansion, Rather, I'm interested in indicating a historical moment when one of the strands of the modern find a similar ambivalence between hostility and affirmation, and underlying it is skepticism about the possibility of living together. In recent times, we have witnessed a strange panic in Europe about the arrival of refugees. I'm suggesting that not only is it not anything new, but one that convulsed Europe throughout the centuries as a result of its relentless wars with each other. The 19th century, for example, had already seen large movements of people from Europe to North America, but even larger numbers to what we now call the global south. Australia, New Zealand, and of course South Africa. These were not refugees, or at least not all of them were refugees. Some were, particularly those who were escaping the almost continuous persecution of Jewish people in Russia. But most of them were not refugees, but people empowered by the expansionist ideology of their states to displace and dispossess non-European people of their rights and their lands, and to call this a civilizing mission. I guess you're familiar with that historical episode. The incredible destruction of the 20th century wars saw not only the pulverization of prosperous and densely populated European cities, but an unprecedented forced transfer of people at the end of the war and during the war. What else is a refugee but this creature? So how quickly it seems that Europe has forgotten this experience. This experience of upheaval and threat to life. It's as it contemplates the arrival of Kurdish people, of Iraqis, of Syrians, just to name that group, all of them fleeing for their lives from wars which were instigated by national power anxieties and the habitual hubris of the well-armed. For a moment, let's just think, what is a refugee? The word now just tumbles out of our lips. Refugee, particularly if you're in Europe. Refugees, etc., asylum seekers, refugees, the two apparently seem to be interchangeable, and they seem to mean something amorphous almost, somehow indicated by their complexion or their religion or something like that. But what is a refugee? And how different is the refugee from the asylum seeker? Do we want to press this distinction? I think it's important. I think of the refugee as, or refugees as people whose lives are at risk. Perhaps as a result of war, perhaps as a result of persecution, or perhaps as a result of deprivation of a different kind. But their lives are at risk. And it seems to me that there is an obligation to offer hospitality to people whose lives are at risk. Is that the same thing as the reckless, brave young people that you see risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean or to cross the English Channel because they want a better life, they want a more prosperous life. No, I don't think it is the same. But of course, it doesn't mean that it is therefore unworthy to desire to prosper or to desire for a better life. Nor does it mean that they are not living deprived and difficult lives. Is one more deserving than the other? I would say possibly, in the sense that, as I've suggested, the refugee, in the term that I'm using, it's an annoying fly here, I'm afraid, wants to eat my few words. The refugee, I think, obliges us to offer hospitality. Whereas the asylum seeker, we can make a national policy out of that and say we will take 3,000, but we won't take more, etc. Instead, what we have is this combination, these two, and this idea, and both of them are narrated, described in criminalizing words and treated as if they are, in fact, beggars or cheats or worse. I would like to suggest that we begin to think about the human obligation in this phenomenon. And that when we speak about this phenomenon, we should perhaps remind ourselves of the North American experience as well, not just think only in terms of Europe. That is to say, the colonization of the continent was also a deprivation of the rights and lands of native people, some of whom now have no recourse but to seek some of the prosperity their oppression has produced. These, in short, are all consequences of colonization. The territorial colonialism we're familiar with, and the modern imperialism which seeks global control in some paranoid anxiety for its safety, these are the sources both of the disruption and of the wars that are taking place in the Middle East as a result of map making that was for the convenience of imperial powers in Somalia, in DRC, etc. So to say the connection between colonialism and refugees seems to me to be perfectly and firmly linked. Indeed, the response to the appearance of people in need in Europe, as if it's an invasion or as if it's something almost like a disease, they will spoil, ruin, infect, that sort of thing, is the most inhumane narrative in our midst. It's not surprising, to finish on a bright note, it's not surprising that the countries that have shown most sympathy for the needs of the Kurdish people and Syrian people fleeing the wars in their countries, it's not surprising that the country that has done this is Germany. Because, of course, the wars that I referred to in the 20th century, at the end of that war, millions of Germans found themselves on the move because they were being expelled from places that they had lived in and thought they belonged to for centuries. It's not, in other words, a unique experience of Africans or of Kurds or of Syrians. And if we keep reminding ourselves that this is something we have lived through for centuries and will live through again, then perhaps the need to act humanely will feel stronger. Thank you very much. Okay.
I think that Professor Gurnah deserves another round of applause for that amazing, for that amazing. It was absolutely remarkable. As you were speaking and in the pauses that you took us through such deep journeys of what not only you have experienced, but you have written and we have read about, and so it's deeply appreciated. We are doing something that we don't always do at our graduation ceremonies, where we would in fact be taking some questions from the audience, and we will be taking questions in batches of 3. So I am counting on you to have some thoughts. I know that a number of you that are here, you have read Professor Gurnah's works, and so some questions from the audience. And as you present, maybe just say who you are, and so that we can keep track of that as well. Please go ahead. There is a microphone that will move in the venue as well. I'm trying to locate my colleague that is doing that.
Brett van Sale. Professor, I've had the pleasure of reading most of your work. And every time you read a book, except for Paradise, you think, is this biographical? And I've sort of, in my mind, I think every book has a bit of biography of yours. Or is it autobiographical? And do you mind telling us, is it your own, well, bits of your life in every book, or is it just all fictional? Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question. We'll take 1 or 2 additional questions, and then I'll be coming to Professor Gurnah to respond to them. So, additional questions? Any questions? There are none. I'm very surprised. If you have any comments that you would like to make in terms of your own reflections. There is a hand at the back that's rising. It's not always an opportunity to have questions to a Nobel laureate, so we do really see this as a very special moment.
Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing us to be part of this journey. Professor Gurnah, I'd like to just ask you, you're an academic, but storytelling is your medium. We have a lot of problems in the world, as you've already expressed, and how do you see storytelling evolving to become a bigger part of the journey to capture people's stories, because that is where the truth lies, in story actually, rather than in the political rhetoric that we see from day to day. How can we maximize the use of story and storytelling to start to address some of these very serious problems we have? Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, we'll give you a moment to think about some more questions. Oh, there's a question over there. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. It's an honor to be here. I just wanted to ask, what is at stake in differentiating the refugee from maybe the economic migrant in a moment where I'm thinking, for example, about Italy funding the slave trade in Libya and training the Libyan military, and what has happened to black people in Libyan prisons? They might not be Of course, the Italian state, for example, refuses the label of refugee more broadly for black people, regardless of where they're coming from. But many might not be coming necessarily from war-torn countries, but they are trapped in the ongoing legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism. So what is at stake in that differentiation? Doesn't it also obscure the ways in which white supremacy continues to create dispossession? Thank you.
Right, thank you for that question. So I'll now invite Professor Gurnah to respond to these questions, and we'll be taking another round of questions as well, so you are welcome to think of some more questions. So Professor Gurnah, you can come over here, or you can use the microphone.
Okay, the first one about autobiography and so on. Well, it's not deliberately autobiographical, but as a writer, I write about what I know. And what I know comes through both personal experience, which might be my own, or personal experience in the sense of some knowing about somebody and what has happened to them, or I might read about it, and the rest I imagine. So, I mean, if you were to take those books as autobiographical, I would have been spanning centuries, as well as living in several different countries and so on, which is not the case. I will take it that it seems true, something like that. I'll take it as a kind of a flattery, as you were, that what you read seems like it happened to a person. But quite a lot of it is not about me, but about, as I say, things that may have happened to me or might have witnessed or whatever. It used to bother me when people said, is it autobiographical? The reason for that is because I thought that suggests that it's kind of unmediated, just writing your life kind of thing, rather than you're fashioning something. In other words, you're making art as well. But I'm not quite so nervous about it now, because I think, I do think that certain kinds of writing does rely very much on experience, on what the writer knows, and therefore there's a possibility of overlapping life with fiction to some extent. The second question was about stories and how stories function, and whether the stories are ways of delivering, as it were, what is happening and how to understand it. I think that's very true. But I don't want to necessarily suggest that that's the only way as well. You know, I think scholarship does its part, stories, fiction. I think of what fiction does, for example, as making the bridge, as it were, between what scholarship does, what research does, which of course is restricted to some extent by the formalities of the discipline, as it were. If you're writing history, you can't just imagine a situation. You have to look at evidence, you have to cite sources, you have to do this, you have to do that, which makes it not easily consumable, as it were, for the general reader. You yourself have to be a scholar in that discipline to be able to follow what is being suggested and what is being proposed. A writer of fiction doesn't have this problem, because the person reading it doesn't have to assume this is a fact, but a way of understanding whatever it is that is being evoked. And it could be you have a different opinion. Well and good, nobody's forcing you not to. Whereas I think a historical, say, I'm using history as an example, a historical narrative would have to be fairly sure that it can stand by whatever it is proposing. Of course, a fiction writer also has to feel like that too, but it's more like speculative rather than saying this is what happened. So I think both work. I think stories perhaps more fully express a kind of a worldview, as well, how people think, how they see the world, not in a scholarly way, but how they understand the world. And sometimes when you hear people telling stories, you know a lot of it is rubbish. Because if you do know something in actual detail about that, you might say, no, actually it's not like that. But nonetheless, what it expresses is how those people there understand the world they live in. So I think stories are important, even if at times they can be dangerous, because if they're bad stories, then they also can become the vehicle through which oppression occurs. So the stories are not always, as well, on the right side in the sense of where we stand. There might be stories about us that don't like us.
Mm.
What is the point of distinguishing between what I have described as refugees, and I didn't use the term economic migrant, and those who are in a more elective way, choosing or trying to get to a better life, which I don't see as in any sense immoral or improper or wrong. What I'm suggesting is that when people's lives are at risk, there is an obligation to be hospitable. When you see these boatloads of people, families trying to cross from Turkey to Greece and then being treated as if they're criminals, I don't think that is hospitality. On the other hand, one of the reasons why so many of the young people who are trying to get to Europe in order to improve their lives, one of the reasons they have to risk their lives is because European countries place such obstacles in front of them, which is a different thing, I think, from seeing people escaping and risking their lives because otherwise they would die from where they are, and saying, no, we are not going to help you. I'm saying in the one sense, there is an obligation, which is human. In the other sense, there has to be justice, which is perhaps a different thing. In the case of the families fleeing war and risk of their lives, you don't say to them, which party did you belong to? Who did you support? Their lives are at risk. First you give them safety, feed them, and then decide what it is that will be done with them. So it's to say, don't lose the meaning of the word or the condition of being a refugee. No recourse. There is no other option but to seek a place of safety.
Right, we'll take another round of questions. This would be the final round of questions. Not seeing, here's one hand. And there is another. There's one right here, and then there's one over there. Can we start with this particular question? I can't see my colleague with the microphone.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Prof. Sina. Thank you, Program Director. We have to utilize this opportunity, as you rightfully say. It's not always that we are in the auspicious presence of a Nobel laureate, so you use the opportunity. So thank you, Prof. Gurnah. I think I was quite moved with the narrative and the way you had articulate the experience of the refugee. I think you rightfully place. It's quite interesting how you place colonialism and the refugee experience, because these two dichotomies speaks directly to it, and much of the refugee debacle springs from as a result of colonialism, which has caused many hardship. Of course, it is experienced in the continent in different ways, and so that's just the comment. And of course, the humanity, as you rightfully said with your last statement there, there's no other way. it is the humanity aspect. Now, I want to check with you, Prof. Gurnah. Obviously, the different continent deals differently with the refugee and migration experience. I want you to draw parallels between the African, the Asian, the European, and the American experience. Now, it's quite interesting that we have the American midterms as we speak, and the issue of migration and refugee experience is prevalent even in the USA, and it's a topical issue. In fact, it's also one of the determining factors of this midterms, as well as 2024. Now, we all know that Trump could be regarded as some kind of but obviously there is some sense also in it. So I would like you to just draw parallels between the continent's handling and experiences of the refugee experience, and perhaps also just refresh the issue of colonialism and the link with the refugee experience. Thank you.
Great. Given the length of that question, I think I'll ask Professor Gurnah to respond to that. And then maybe my colleague who's doing the Q&A, there's the question right here, so you can come over here while you also think about shortening your next question. Professor Gurnah, over to you.
Well, it's interesting to raise the issue of how different reception of refugees has been, or is rather, across continents, or you might even say over history. It seems to me, I mean, I don't know enough to answer your question, to tell you the simple truth, but I'm quite sure that it is different. At the moment, I mean, I suppose you could take the example of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. You could take the example of the Uyghur people in China, who are not exactly refugees, but are oppressed minorities. I think these details matter. What we have in the case of the examples I've been mentioning are clear cases of people who have to leave their country and can only, as far as they see, now you can say this is a mistake on their part, as far as they can see, the place of safety is Europe. Now it could be that this is a mistake, but that's neither here nor there. They're there, if you see what I mean. If one of the largest hosts of refugees has been Turkey, for example, which has absorbed millions of those Syrians and Kurdish people. Obviously, they would be treated in ways which are not going to be to say, okay, neighbor, you're welcome, stay here. But millions have been accommodated. Now, we might say that's an example of a different approach. I don't know the details to say whether this is altogether humane, but it sounds to me more humane than allowing them to drown in the Aegean Sea. But I can't really answer your question about all these other continental differences because I don't know. As for what the American concerns, North American concerns with refugees from Central and South America, well, that's an ongoing, centuries-long issue. And every now and then it becomes a panic like it has now. But a lot of it is also a result of the expansionist policies of the United States itself in engaging, interfering, and expropriating both Mexican lands in the first instance, if you want to go back a little way, 150 years ago, and the continuing intervention in the politics and social lives of the states in South America and Latin America and Central America. So you impoverish people, they see prosperity over there, what the hell else can they do apart from try to get there?
Yeah. Great. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's really a great honor to be in your presence as well. I'm Katya Sim, and I'm really going to go more practical. I work in a faculty of education, and on the coalface, a lot of your work sort of deals with the wrestling of identity. In a lot of our schools, we deal with children who are refugees, and our teachers have to be prepared for the work that they need to do beyond the curriculum. In other words, they've got to work with trauma, they've got to work with identity, and also, as we were reminded, about the danger of a single story. And I wonder what your thoughts are on a more practical level about how one could use some literature, around the difficult conversations, around the unburdening, so to speak. So if reading leads towards better thought development, towards better writing, then what would your comments be on a more practical level about the use of literature, and particularly the works that you write?
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Can I?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, there are people doing some really, really good work along those lines. I don't know about here, but there are people who are using writing as a way of encouraging, I guess, both narrative skills in the language that some of them are learning, but also a way of remembering and understanding, reflecting on. Of course, if they're young, they don't reflect in the way that an adult might, but nonetheless, there is something in the process of re-narrating or narrating an experience like that, which is a process of reflection. And I know for sure that this has worked with some schools, some of the places where refugees or children of refugees are being looked after. So I think that is important, that there is something in that. So, but I mean, how can you measure that? It's just that it's one of the ways, one of the things that enables people to kind of situate, I suppose, what has happened to them. It's not something that's going to go away. It's not like writing, it means that they will remember it. They will remember it anyway, always. But writing, or that process of retelling events, I think has the ability to maybe take some of the poison out of it.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And the last final question.
Geography. For instance, in a secular colonialism type, what is your observation of societal integration project? And for instance,
Depends on the historical moment. If you compare the appearance of the Spanish conquistadores in the 16th century in South America and Mexico to maybe other forms. And if you look through history, colonialism depends, European, I'm thinking, colonialism. Of course, there were other colonialisms as well. And particularly the overseas variety, as opposed, say, to the internal colonialism of the Russian Empire or the Chinese Empire, or indeed of the German Empire until the 19th century. That those were internal in the sense that they just colonized adjacent territories. But the difference with particularly with the Spanish, the British, the French, and the Portuguese is that they're overseas. So they're encountering people who are completely different from themselves, both in appearance, in religion, in language, etc. And the temptation to think of them as lesser human beings was obviously a great deal stronger. Although, again, this is why I'm saying it's different, because at times they were not strong enough to be coercive. And so they had to do different kinds of negotiations until they were strong enough. You take the example of, say, German colonialism in the 19th century. It comes at the peak of European technological superiority in the late 19th century. So they enter into, particularly in Africa, they enter into the colonial enterprise with this idea of domination, subjugation, obedience. There's no need to negotiate anything. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why the experience of German colonialism in Africa was so violent and brutal, both in this part of the world as well as in Deutsche Ostafrika, what then became Tanzania. By which time the British could be kind of like cool and say, no, 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 we don't do things like that. We do things like, because they'd already done their killings. And they'd had a long, long time to take charge and control. So it's different, and we have to know, we have to be specific about what form these colonialism took in order to understand what really happened and to understand how to deal with them now.
Thank you very much, Professor Gurnah. Let's give Professor Gurnah another round of applause. That actually brings us to the end of the Q&A, and there is so much that you give to us to reflect and to learn in your readings, in your presentation, and the inspiration that you leave with us. Thank you.
All I can say is wow. I saw, Professor Sina, you wanted to make sure that the audience sees that indeed UJ gave a prof an honorary doctorate, and I see our registrar is holding it there. Perhaps this is the right moment to hand that doctorate to Prof Gurnah. Thank you. I can promise you that scroll is not empty. Not so very long ago, the earth numbered 2,000 million inhabitants, 500 million men and 1,500 million natives. The former had the word, the others had the use of it. These are the opening lines of the preface of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon warned us that decolonization would be a difficult, often violent, but an incredibly necessary project in a post-colonial setting. Though in South Africa we have long been on a journey of decolonization, or arguably a reclamation of identities and systems, decolonization of knowledge certainly came to the fore once again in 2015 as the Fees Must Fall protest engulfed the nation. Though inclusive of a much broader debate around access to higher education, the movement centered around the need for Africa to reclaim its right to tell its stories, to explain its own history, and to take its place alongside other dominant knowledge systems. In his seminal work, Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote, open quote, "If we are to do anything about our individual and collective being today, then we have to coldly and consciously look at what imperialism has been doing to us and to our view of ourselves in the universe," close quote. This evening has represented this sentiment in practice. Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah's literary and academic legacy has echoed these very objectives and has represented the reclamation and telling of history from the perspective of the subject. This is the very embodiment of decolonization. His work, ladies and gentlemen, reminds us that our identities, histories, and experiences are complex and multidimensional. As he phrased it in his Nobel lecture in November last year, open quote, "I believe that writing also has to show what can be otherwise, what it is that the hard domineering eye cannot see, what makes people, apparently small in stature, feel assured in themselves regardless of the disdain of others." So I found it necessary to write about that as well, and to do so truthfully, so that both the ugliness and the virtue come through, and the human being appears out of the simplification and stereotype. When that works, a kind of beauty comes out of it, close quote. Our stories are not tidy, ladies and gentlemen. They are not compactly summed up and easily closed. They are complex and demand to be told. The Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, in a TED talk some years ago, warned of the danger of a single story. While American and British books she had read stirred her imagination and opened up new worlds for her, she says the unintended consequences was that she did not know that Africans could exist in literature. As she said, open quote, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story, close quote. Gurnah's work is crucial in challenging this phenomenon. As Gurnah told the New York Times a few months ago, open quote, when I speak, I'm speaking as a voice among many. And if you hear an echo in your own experience, that's great, close quote. It has been an honor to host Prof Gurnah and award him with this honorary doctorate this evening. It represents our commitment to the project of decolonization, the emphasis on reimagining our future through a Pan-African lens and a celebration of the African voice, which, as Gurnah describes it, is about experience, not about where, a sentiment that demonstrates the impact of his words and our ability to resonate with his characters even against differing contexts. As Herbert Isaac Ernest Dlomo said in the early decades of the 20th century, open quote, one thing so far we have been guilty of is neglecting our cultural men. They write and write, but very little is written about them. We need more books by Africans on Africa, close quote. Gurnah and his body of work represent this sentiment and remind us of the weight African narratives from the African point of view hold in this often challenging and fraught post-colonial setting. It reminds us that we hold the power to reclaiming and shaping the dominant narratives and that the current order can absolutely be changed. I thank you, Kea leboha, baya danki, nyabonga. You are requested to stand for the singing of the national anthem, the words of which can be found on the last page of the program. Le kgopelwa hore le eme ka maoto ge go opela koša ya setšhaba yeo mantšu a yona a ka hwetšwa go letlakaleng la mafelelo la lenaneo. South Africa. Honored guests, we have reached the end of the formal proceedings for today. You are invited to join us in the theatre foyer for some refreshments. By virtue of the powers vested in me, I now dissolve this congregation of the University of Johannesburg. Krachtens die bevoegdhede aan my toevertrou, ontbind ek nou hierdie kongregasie van die Universiteit van Johannesburg. Thank you.